The Everglades, a topic of international concern in this era of environmental awareness. But what is the Everglades? What are its problems? Why should we be concerned over its survival? As in most ecological systems, the problems of the Everglades are complex. Any attempt to study these problems demands an understanding of the region, what it is and how it functions. This unique region of North America is the result of many circumstances: geography, geology, climate, and a host of interacting factors. The Everglades is located in South Florida, the southernmost part of the continental United States. South Florida lies on the edge of the American tropics and is closest to the tropical islands of the West Indies. It is only 135 miles from Cuba to the mainland of South Florida. Although the region of South Florida, south of the latitude of Lake Okeechobee, is generally called the Everglades, the region is really made up of 4 distinct physiographic provinces. Only one of these provinces is properly known as the Everglades, but there are important reasons why all 4 should be considered together. All 4 of these regions are interrelated physically and biologically, and portions of all 4 are located in the most troubled setting of all, Everglades National Park. In seeing South Florida, one of the first impressions is the absence of hills and valleys. South Florida is anything but scenic, except perhaps to the well-trained eye. The highest elevations are found along the most eastern of the 4 physiographic provinces, the Atlantic Coastal Ridge. Typical elevations of the coastal ridge are on the order of only 16 to 20 feet above sea level, yet the ridge is high enough to act as a dam, restricting waters of the South Florida interior from flowing to the Atlantic Ocean. The vegetation of the ridge is characteristically of pines and low palmettos. The true Everglades province lies to the west of the Atlantic Coastal Ridge. It is a vast province, originally extending from Lake Okeechobee almost to the southern tip of the Florida mainland. The Everglades resembles a prairie in appearance, since its principal vegetation is of grass-like plants, the best known being sawgrass. Looking closely at sawgrass blades, one can appreciate the flesh-cutting power of this plant. The surface waters filter very slowly as one broad and shallow expanse through the sawgrass prairies from Lake Okeechobee toward Florida Bay and the Gulf of Mexico. In fact, the Everglades has been appropriately called the River of Grass. To the west of the Everglades lies a third province, known as Big Cypress Swamp. The Big Cypress is a more varied province biologically, having a great variety of plant communities. Its most abundant tree is cypress, a type of conifer. Cypress is peculiar as a conifer in its seasonal loss of leaves and its habit of growing in the water. The water flow pattern of Big Cypress Swamp is more complicated than that of the Everglades region. Some of it flows eastward, joining the Everglades drainage. Ultimately, all the flow from the Big Cypress heads south and southwest through Everglades National Park and toward the Gulf of Mexico, where it enters the 4th region of South Florida. This 4th region is the great expanse of coastal mangrove swamps. It is here that the fresh waters from the Everglades and the Big Cypress Swamp mix with the saline tidal waters. The region is permeated with an interconnected system of bays, lakes, tidal creeks, and rivers, a challenging region to any explorer. For visitors to South Florida, perhaps the most important characteristic of the area is climate. So it may be also for the plants and animals living there. The kinds of tropical organisms which have been able to reach South Florida are those which are able to cross from island to island through the West Indies. Storms, particularly hurricanes, have been responsible for bringing the seeds of tropical plants to South Florida. A study of the plant species just south of Miami revealed that over 80% of the species were kinds found on the islands of the West Indies. Some of these included the highly valued West Indian mahogany and the royal palm. The overland trip around the Gulf of Mexico involving cold winters prevents an invasion of plants and animals from the American tropics. However, a number of tropical insects have reached South Florida. A good example is the zebra butterfly. But aside from plants, insects, and a few birds, such as the roseate spoonbill, few tropical organisms have been successful in reaching South Florida. There are no native monkeys and only one native parrot, the now extinct Carolina parakeet. In the park's fresh waters, largemouth bass, bluegills, and golden shiners are abundant. The same species found northward even to the Great Lakes states. Despite the scarcity of tropical animals in South Florida, it is nevertheless the animal life which sparks the enthusiasm of most visitors in Everglades National Park. With little effort, plenty of alligators and a bald eagle or two can be seen among a myriad of water birds and reptiles for which the area is so famous. The greatest share of attention is received by the large water birds. They range from the bizarre spoonbills and wood storks to the more familiar great blue herons and common egrets. Although it would seem that all of these birds are competing for one food supply, such is not the case. All of these water birds feed in ways specific to their own kind and thus tend to catch different sorts of food. For example, this Louisiana heron is highly impatient when feeding. He can be seen literally to run after the 2 or 3 inch shallow water fish he finds so attractive. The snowy egret often fishes in an entirely different manner. He may select a good fishing spot and wait for fish to come to him. His technique is highly selective for the common 1 inch long mosquito fish, which swim close to the surface. The little blue heron stalks quietly through shallow water or on floating vegetation, such as this water lettuce in Big Cypress Swamp. He searches patiently for crayfish, small frogs, and unwary little fish hiding among the water plants. The great blue heron is a fisherman of great patience. He stands silently in foot-deep water, waiting and watching for a big, tasty sunfish, or even an eel, which he prefers to the smaller prey sought by the other water birds. In contrast to the interest in fish expressed by the herons and egrets, the white ibis, recognized by their downward curved beaks, feed primarily on invertebrates. Their technique of probing and feeling for prey is most successful in catching crayfish, small shrimps, and insects. No story of the ecology of South Florida would be complete without a look at the alligator, whose natural range extends as far north as North Carolina and as far west as Texas. Alligators are not only the most popular single species of wildlife in South Florida, but they are the #1 most important species in the ecology of the Everglades and Big Cypress Swamp. In fact, without the alligator, these regions could not support nearly the number of water birds they do. The reason for this importance arises out of 2 factors: seasonal rainfall and alligator behavior. It works like this. The rainfall in South Florida is very seasonal. Most of the average annual precipitation of about 60 inches falls between mid-May and the end of October. During this period, water levels rise, and in normal years, nearly all of these two regions are flooded. Fish move out over the shallow glades and cypress forests, and their populations grow during these warm, wet months of summer. But beginning in November, the frequent thunderstorms of summer come to an end. Often during the months of February, March, and April, scarcely any rain falls. Water levels recede, the ground dries, and huge proliferation of fish spawned the previous summer become confined to the only remaining open water. Most of the remaining water in mid-spring is located in the innumerable small ponds which dot both of these regions. These ponds are the work of alligators and are called alligator holes. Alligators are actually responsible for these ponds. They maintain them by digging out the bottoms and uprooting vegetation. So how do alligators help water birds? The answer is this. The food supply of most of these water birds is the fish and small shrimp which have been nicely congregated into the alligator holes by the receding waters. All this happens just at the time that these birds are nesting. Huge flocks of these beautiful herons, egrets, ibis, and storks move from alligator hole to alligator hole throughout the spring months, literally gorging themselves. The abundant food supply allows these birds, such as the common egret, whose nestlings are shown here, to raise more young than would be possible otherwise. But the importance of the alligator does not end here. Some alligator holes are deep enough that many fish and other aquatic organisms escape the hungry beaks of the predators. These then become the parents of the next generation of aquatic life to be spawned in the coming summer months, and the cycle repeats itself. Food chains in the Everglades form another interesting study. In the freshwater Everglades, much of the sunlight energy which keeps the cycles of life operating is initially caught by minute algae growing in this thick sponge-like algal mat. This kind of mat covers huge expanses of the Everglades. The younger growing end of this bladderwort is free of algal periphyton, but the older end has become completely covered by the yellow-colored algal association. The algal mat and the periphyton are eaten by a variety of 1 to 2 inch fish, including sailfin mollies and the colorful flagfish. And by these very abundant freshwater shrimps called prawns. Numerous other small organisms, such as aquatic insects, crustaceans, and snails, also feed on the algae. These smaller organisms fall prey to the more carnivorous little fish, the most abundant one being the mosquito fish. The assemblage of small fish and prawns then fall prey to the several species of sunfish and this largemouth bass, a favorite among the freshwater sport fishermen. But the most abundant predators on the small fish are the Florida gar. Gar, in turn, are the most important food of the alligator. An interesting short food chain involves these large apple snails. Apple snails graze on the algal mat during the wet part of the year when the Everglades is flooded. The eggs of this snail have hard, drought-resistant shells and are laid on plant stalks, such as on these pickerel weed stems above the waterline. The apple snail is the sole food of one of North America's rarest birds, the Everglades kite. During periods of low water, a few kites can be seen along canals where they glide about searching for the fleshy snails which they pick up and carry to a perch. The short, sharply curved beak of the Everglades kite enables it to reach inside the snail's shell and remove the animal with ease. In the mangrove forests of the saltwater fringe of South Florida, perhaps the most important source of energy supporting the excellent fishing for sea trout, snook, and redfish begins in the mangroves themselves. Dead leaves of the mangroves fall into the water and are decomposed by fungi and bacteria. The partially decomposed leaves containing millions of tiny microorganisms of decay are eaten by small forage fish, shrimps, and crabs. These in turn feed the larger fish, which finally feed men, porpoises, and brown pelicans alike. Although the multitude of reptiles and birds steal the show for most visitors to South Florida, it is the vegetation that claims the interest of most biologists. An impressive feature of the vegetation is the abrupt transitions from one community to another. The most important factors shaping these communities are fire and water. Contrary to popular belief, many types of plant communities are dependent on fire. The pineland of the Atlantic coastal ridge would be replaced by forests of broad-leafed tropical hardwoods if it were not for fire. The fire-scarred pines and the low palmettos here in Everglades National Park are highly resistant to fires, but hardwood trees are not. Pinelands which have not burned in 2 or 3 years begin to develop a dense understory of shrubs and young hardwood trees. Given time, such areas will finally grow into hardwood forest, called hammocks, in which the dense shade will prevent the survival of the pine seedlings. But fire kills the hardwoods easily. The fire which passed through this area only 2 weeks ago has left many dead hardwoods, but has not hurt the pines and palmettos. Like the pinelands, the sawgrass Everglades is highly resistant to fire damage, provided there is enough water in the soil to protect the roots of the plants. Given a few months, the passage of this sawgrass fire will be visible only as a lush, light green growth of new sawgrass. The most sharply defined communities in the Everglades region are the tree islands. As would be suspected, these tree islands occupy sites of slightly higher elevation than the surrounding marsh. The highest and driest of these tree islands support species such as the gumbo limbo, characteristic of the tropical hammocks of the coastal ridge. But the lower tree islands are flooded too much of the year to support hammock vegetation. They are composed of an assemblage of marsh tree species such as pond apple, red bay, and willow. An interesting feature of these lower tree islands is that the middle of the island is often occupied by an alligator hole. In fact, the activities of alligators piling up debris along the edges of their ponds is thought to be the origin of the higher grounds on which the tree island species are first able to take root. Open water standing on the ground can have other interesting effects. For example, although the Everglades and Big Cypress region do not contain any streams or rivers, there are watercourses which are deeper than the surrounding territory. Such a watercourse is called a slough, spelled S-L-O-U-G-H. Because the sloughs are deeper, they contain water nearly the entire year. The higher humidity along the sloughs supports an intriguing association of plants called epiphytes. Literally, epiphytes are plants upon plants. Spanish moss and certain kinds of ferns, such as the resurrection fern, are abundant in the trees along the sloughs. To botanists and many other observant people, sloughs are the most fascinating environments in all of South Florida. In summary, we have seen what South Florida looks like and discussed its ecology. We have seen that flood, drought, and fire are important factors in regulating the nature of these regions. So what are the problems that we hear about? Some of the important ones are these. Drainage canals illustrated on this map and flood control activities have reduced the water supply in South Florida. These activities have the effect of accentuating the spring droughts, causing alligator holes and sloughs to go completely dry before the nesting of water birds is complete. Extreme dryness alters the effect of fire. With water levels dropping below the soil surface, the peat soils of the Everglades and the Big Cypress burn, killing the roots of even the most fire-resistant pines and cypress, and leaving only bare rock upon which little will grow for years to come. Most fires today are started by people, and many are started when water levels are dangerously low. Alligator poaching has had profound effects on the ecology of the regions also. We have seen how important the alligator hole is in the ecology of the Everglades and the Big Cypress. But without alligators, gator holes soon fill in and no longer supply the refuges for fish and the feeding oasis for water birds. Overgrown gator holes are commonplace today. As if to add salt to the ecological injuries of South Florida, there have been plans to construct a major jet port on the border region between the Big Cypress and the Everglades. This kind of development inevitably brings with it cancer-like attributes of economic growth, with its pollution problems, further efforts to control water levels, and so on. After one runway was completed, conservationists managed to stop further work. Today, the runway is used for jet training only, but issues of this kind will inevitably arise in the future. The problem of introduced exotic species is another headache in South Florida. Many introduced species are not successful, such as this scarlet ibis from South America. It is one of the few remaining of an introduced flock. But many introductions are far too successful at the expense of desirable native species. The tree upon which this beautiful ibis is perched is an Australian pine, a tremendously successful invader in South Florida. Some introduced species upset man's activities directly and become serious pests. The Cuban tree frog is an example. These largest of all tree frogs found in North America climb between wires in electrical transformer stations, causing blowouts that have cost many thousands of dollars in damage. The list of problems goes on and on. Man has upset the natural balances which worked throughout history. What can he do? Should he do anything to save a region such as Everglades National Park? The key problem in the changing Everglades is water. Both water quality and the seasonal supply of water. But the urban areas around the Everglades are growing and depending upon the same water supply. Miami is expanding at a rate of nearly 1,000 people per week. More people demand more water. In the spring of 1971, the public water utility of Miami appealed to the people to use no more water than was absolutely necessary. The supply was severely short. When will this trend stop? When there is not enough water for alligators, or when there is not enough water for alligators and people. In this simple example, we can see that the life support system of the Everglades, of all those creatures residing there, is closely related to life support systems of the people of South Florida. Many other relationships could be drawn, not just in South Florida, but all over the earth. Remember, when the miner's canary died, something was wrong with the air in the mine. The health of a life support system can be measured by the health of its parts. So the issue is clearly one of using our intelligence to avoid hardships, perhaps catastrophe, before it is too late. Both people and alligators have survived on Earth together for a long time. Why not keep it that way?